Welcome to the season finale of Light O'Clock, Season 3. Today, we're turning our attention to a form of pollution you might not think about very often: light pollution. When you hear the word pollution, you probably imagine smoke in the air or plastic in the ocean, and not light. But actually, light pollution is with us every single night. It's the orange sky glow over our cities, the street lights outside our windows, the garden lamps that we live on, and the glowing billboards from advertisements that never turn off. Basically, light pollution is all artificial light produced by humans in the evening, a time that would otherwise be dark. And astronomers were the first to notice it, actually, when they realized that night light was affecting their ability to study the sky and the stars. But since then, scientists have realized that the effect of light pollution go beyond that light pollution might affect our health and that of other species. And so to really understand light pollution in all of its aspects and complexities, in this episode, we'll hear from 3 researchers, each looking at light pollution from a different perspective. First, we'll be asking, is increasing exposure to light at night bad for humans? Could it raise a risk of certain health problems, including cancer? Second, how does human-made light affect wildlife, and could it be threatening biodiversity? And finally, what we can do, both as individuals and as policymakers, to use light more responsibly. Let's dive in. So for our first question, is exposure to light at night bad for humans, and could it increase the risk of developing certain health problems? I spoke to Barbara Harding from the University of New Mexico.
My training is in epidemiology, and I've focused primarily on circadian disruption and cardiovascular health. And I work at the College of Population Health here at the University of New Mexico.
And the first thing that I asked Barbara was to recap for us what happens to our circadian rhythms when we are exposed to light at night.
So the kind of main regulator of the circadian system lies within the brain in the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And there's a pathway that exists, but the main regulator of this system is light exposure. And to kind of boil it down into a few steps, this is very oversimplified. Light hits the retina. It then communicates with different cells called iPRGCs. Those are the main ones that we're talking about. And then we have a cascade and some hormones that take into effect. And this is the main sort of regulation. What happens here is when light is coming into the retina, it suppresses melatonin production. Melatonin normally is low during the daytime, kind of the natural daytime where we have sun and light exposure in our homes or office spaces. And then during the night, when it starts getting darker, the melatonin starts creeping up and getting to peak levels when we are most sleepy. And so when we have light exposure, again, we mess up that cascade of melatonin production. Melatonin is suppressed and we kind of don't feel as sleepy. We probably fall asleep later. And this is why light is so crucially important. It's the main regulator of that whole circadian clock system. And the circadian system is complex. I know you've covered it a lot on your previous podcast episodes, but we have this, again, the main master clock in the brain. I kind of like to think of it as like the conductor of a band, like the one that's keeping everyone in sync and setting the tempo. But there's also peripheral clocks all over the body that, in an ideal situation are in harmony with the master clock in the brain, but they can fall out of harmony. So one thing we're worried about is the master clock itself being out of sync based off of light exposure at the wrong times. But we're also worried about our peripheral clocks, for instance, like our metabolism or our blood pressure. These other clocks can get out of sync as well when we mess with the natural flow and when we have light exposure at the wrong times of the day and night.
And if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you're like, okay, cool. light at night, not good for our circadian system. But what about the effect of light at night on our health beyond our circadian system? You said basically artificial light at night throws our body clocks off, not just the central body clock, the master circadian rhythm, the conductor of this orchestra that you were referring to, or this band, but also all the peripheral clocks. Do we also know anything about other health consequences of artificial light at night? So are there studies that look at the consequences of artificial light at night on health, like beyond circadian rhythms?
Yeah, great question. I think this is what all of us want to know, right? Like, sure, artificial light at night might be bad, but what does it really do? Like, what are the negative effects? So in the literature, and at least based off of, kind of the research that I've done, I think the most work has focused on artificial light at night in relation to cancer, cardiometabolic health, mental health, and sleep disorders. But there has been investigations with lots of other things, like allergies and asthma and lots of different health outcomes.
So recently, Barbara and her group have worked on a meta-analysis on the relationship between artificial light at night and cancer. So basically, they were trying to combine the results of many different studies on this topic to see what was the overall pattern in the results.
Artificial light at night is generally broken up into indoor artificial light at night and outdoor artificial light at night. So, as mentioned, indoor would be things that you're doing inside of your home, the lights that are on inside of the home, maybe a TV screen. Whereas outdoor really relates to, lights on the streets or lights from the shop windows and those types of things. So we were interested in both, right? Because both they combine together to create artificial light at night, in totality. So we searched the literature and looked at things related to artificial light at night and cancer. And we ended up finding 28 studies that met our criteria. Of these, the vast majority focused on breast cancer, and there were very few of the other cancer sites. So most of our results relate to breast cancer. We had some results related to prostate cancer, but there were only 2 studies. And then there are several other studies that are just kind of one for thyroid cancer or one for a different type of cancer. And so it's really hard for us to make any sort of generalizations when we have so little in the other cancer areas. But what we found was that for outdoor artificial light at night, people that were exposed to greater amounts experienced a 12% increased risk of breast cancer as related to people that had a lower level of outdoor artificial light at night exposure. The results for indoor artificial light exposure were lower, and also they didn't reach statistical significance. So what we mean there is they might just be due to chance. And so we don't really put any big weight in findings that are not statistically significant.
So basically, looking at the findings from the breast cancer studies, Barbara's team found that exposure to outdoor artificial light at night was related to higher risk of breast cancer. But the results for indoor light exposure were not as robust.
And the other thing that we really tried to focus on when doing this work was on the measurement type. So this is another construct. Now we have artificial light at night. We break that into indoor and outdoor. We also break artificial light at night into different types of light. So there's kind of, red wavelengths, there's blue wavelengths, there's different wavelengths of light. The ones that we care about the most for the circadian regulation are blue light wavelengths. These are shorter wavelengths. They're the ones that have the greatest impact on those iPRGC cells in the eye. So we also tried to focus on studies that had specifically focused on blue wavelengths. And those indicated more elevated risks, but there were only a couple of them. So that's kind of the kicker. We really need more studies that focus on blue light wavelength specifically, and not just kind of a global look at how much light exposure someone might be receiving.
And talking about this idea of distinguishing different types of light, I asked Barbara, how is artificial light at night actually measured in these studies?
So when we do this, search of the literature, people are measuring this in lots of different ways. It's not always easy to compare, apples and apples. We do a lot of comparing of apples and different fruits. But we see the main measures that are used are sensor-based measurement of artificial light at night. We also have questionnaire-based measurement of artificial light at night. So questions like, how dark is your room? Or, do you use shades to cover your windows? Things of that nature. And then the third major type is satellite-based measurement. So with satellite-based measurement, we have satellites, people up at maybe like the space station. They take photos looking down on the Earth. From that, we can see different light exposures, in terms of the kind of resolution of the images that they take. And they can turn those, when I say they, scientists can turn these photos into measurements that are at a specific resolution that help us get at kind of residential light exposure. They don't do as good of a job as, an individual measure type thing. Sensors are really more of an ecologic kind of study, right? They help us get more or less in the neighborhood area. More modern satellites can get much higher resolution, so down to maybe a couple blocks. And so that's helpful. Other satellites, some of the most common ones, do a poor job really with resolution. So they measure it, kind of a 2 kilometer or greater. And so that would be, assigning maybe you have a specific light exposure and you live 10 minutes away from me and I have the same light exposure as you. So there's obviously issues there. I would say the gold standard is really sensor-based measurement. And I think to be specific here, that would be a sensor that's worn on the person's body and also a sensor that's placed at the home. So you get, both things measured really well. And also a good sense of when people are inside the home versus outside of the home so that we as scientists could then kind of comb through and make changes if needed. But that's obviously a very expensive situation where you have to buy everyone multiple sensors when each one is, multiple hundreds of dollars. The questionnaire-based measurement is the easiest, the least expensive. But again, even in giving you examples, right, Karolina, it's very subjective. How dark is your room at night? Or sometimes people ask if you wake to go to the restroom, do you turn on the light? Or do you have a clock that has, light next to where you're sleeping? And so really assessing from those questions how much light exposure people have inside of their room is really inaccurate and hard to do. So, you have pros and cons of everything.
Right. So basically what these studies do is that they measure light exposure, either using satellite images, sensors that are worn by participants, or just asking participants what kind of light they're exposed to using questionnaires. And then they associate that light exposure that they measure to the presence or the absence of a cancer diagnosis after a certain period of time, like 2 years later. But I know what you're thinking. What about all the other things that could cause a cancer diagnosis in those 2 years that are not light pollution? So I'm just thinking, with these studies, it sounds like, okay, sure, you're exposed to light of a certain type at some time, and then 2 years later, you may or may not develop cancer. And there might be so many other things that cause this cancer diagnosis or the fact that you develop cancer, right? So can you tell us a bit more about how do you make sure that it's really the light pollution?
Yeah, so we are always thinking about confounding. So this sense of exactly as you're asking, how do I know it's really light exposure? Maybe I live in the center of Barcelona and I'm exposed to a lot of light, but I also have a lot of air pollution, or there's a lot of noise in my neighborhood, I'm constantly hearing things, or I don't know, I have access to different foods and so on and so forth. There's so many other factors that come into play that all on their own right could be related to a cancer diagnosis. And so what we do in studies is we try to control for these things. So, ideally we'd have some sort of experimental study where people are exposed to exactly the same thing, except we just tweak their light exposure, right? Then we can be sure or more sure that it's really light exposure that might be causing any effect. In observational studies, which is most of what I am doing these days, we just try to assess all of those other factors. So we try to have questionnaires that assess lots of different things. We might use sensors to assess maybe noise, like I was mentioning, or we might use some area-based measurements of air pollution, for instance. And in our analyses, we control for all those factors. So we essentially then compare someone who has the same air pollution, the same dietary pattern, the same sleep habits, the same pre-existing health conditions with someone else, right? That's the similar things of everything, except their light exposure differs. It's not a perfect scenario, but when we measure all of these other exposures quite well and we adjust for those in our analyses, then we can become more confident that it's really light exposure.
Looking beyond cancer, Barbara also did a study on light at night and cardiometabolic risk in Catalonia, Spain. There, she found that total exposure to high levels of light at night with increased risk of obesity, increased risk of hemorrhagic stroke, and higher levels of cholesterol as compared to people who had lower light exposure at night. So really suggesting an increased risk in cardiometabolic outcomes with higher levels of light exposure at night. So to summarize, research seems to support that higher levels of light exposure at night are associated with negative health consequences. But I mean, how do we go from living in a very light polluted area and from keeping bright lights on in your bedroom before sleep to something like cancer? What is the mechanism there? And so, how do we make sense of these findings? So we have higher artificial light at night, indoor, outdoor, leading to worse health consequences like breast cancer, cardiometabolic outcomes. What is the link between these two things, right? It might not be very clear. And also maybe what is circadian disruption? Where is it playing in this equation, let's say?
Yeah, great question. So I think, again, another thing that we could do a much better job on is having studies that have exposure assessment, outcome assessment, and which add in these mechanisms that we think are happening and might be explaining what we're seeing. So, doing assessments of hormone levels, which we know are greatly influenced by light exposure because they're, so strongly regulated by the circadian system. Or looking at things like maybe blood pressure throughout the day, for instance, or maybe it's a inflammation-related mechanism, which we know that the immune system also follows circadian rhythms. So I think it would be fantastic if we were able to do some larger scale study where we were able to look at some of those mechanisms and see if we see among people that maybe have the most dysregulated hormones or the most dysregulated immune function, or maybe it's the most dysregulated metabolism, if we can then put these blocks kind of together and fit. But I think that it's due to light exposure causing circadian disruption, causing these health outcomes, because the circadian system is so integral in everything that our body does throughout the 24-hour day. One piece, which is sometimes hard for people in my field to talk about, is also sleep. So light exposure and sleep are so closely aligned too. And we know that sleep is so crucial for health. And so I think also in people that have the artificial light at night exposure, we know that they are receiving on average less sleep and poorer quality sleep. And so I think the, years of this sort of sleep deficiency or sleep problems can also be having, a sort of that pathway is leading to a lot of major disease outcomes, such as cancer or cardiometabolic health outcomes.
So I guess stay tuned for more research on this topic, hopefully. Now we've explored how light pollution can affect us as humans, from our circadian rhythms to cancer and cardiometabolic health. But of course, we're not the only ones who experience the night. The artificial light that we spread into the environment doesn't just stop at our windows, it spills into forests, rivers, oceans, and literally everywhere we shine light. And so, what are the consequences of human-made light pollution on other species? For this, we need to talk about ecological light pollution.
Well, anything that disrupts natural patterns of light and dark from their what they've been for millions of years that then influences living organisms, generally not people. So it's the everything but people part.
This is Travis Longcore, adjunct professor at the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at University of California, Los Angeles. Travis is one of the people to have invented the term ecological light pollution. And when we started our conversation, he told me, well, it makes sense that animals are also affected by light pollution. Because after all organisms who have evolved on Earth got used to this very reliable pattern of night and day, dark and light. And just like humans, they make use of this. And so animals, just like humans, also use light information to regulate when they sleep and when they're active, but also use light for orientation, for telling time of day, and also use light to communicate with each other. When you look for examples of how animals are affected by light pollution, two examples come up again and again on the internet. Birds who die in collisions with illuminated buildings, and sea turtles who get disoriented by bright light on the beach. I asked Travis to explain what happens exactly in these cases.
Those two examples are like ones that were, as I refer to them, as ones that leave dead bodies on the ground, and which make them conspicuous to us as humans. And they're both examples of how light is used for orientation. And so movement and orientation in the three dimensions of the world. And so birds during migration, most birds migrate at night, and they do so because it's cooler and then they can eat during the day, and probably less predation pressure as well. But because of that, and because they did it under natural darkness for all these years, when you start introducing lights, it's sometimes the phrase, it's a supernatural stimulus. It's like it can't quite understand what it means. And so we now have proof from weather radar that birds are attracted to light that they see at night. So we kind of knew this in the past because people would look at, people used to use fire. Indigenous people would use fire to attract birds and kill them to eat them. But then there's a famous painting of the Eddystone Light in what became the UK that had just all sorts of birds attracted to it. So lighthouses were one, and especially once we get super bright lighthouses attract all these birds. And then as you go on in time, now we can prove that it's not just they're running into it because that's their route, but they're actually being attracted from the surroundings. And that's dangerous to them. One, because they're not going where they need to go. They can get tired. They run into the big cables that hold up communication towers if it's a light on a tower. They also then end up in cities where at the base of these lights, where there's all sorts of glass and other dangerous things that they can collide with and die. And so this birds on migration is a pretty clear example of that. And at a smaller scale, sea turtles and sea turtle hatchlings are another example of this. So female sea turtles, after they live out in the ocean and go back to the beach where they were born, they don't like to go to beaches that are particularly bright. And so the choice of where sea turtle eggs get laid has to do with the brightness of the beach. But then when the hatchlings, so she scrapes a hole, puts eggs in it, eggs develop, and then they synchronously come out and crawl up out of the nest, and they need to make a mad dash for the ocean because that's where they're going to be the safest, because on land there's a bunch of predators that think they're tasty little morsels. And so the problem is that they will go away from the darkest horizon. And so historically, the darkest horizon was the land and the vegetation on land, because there'd be some reflectivity and lower, and just the glow of the natural brightness of the sky over the ocean, and not the plants. And so on land. And so once you change that, you actually change the direction that the animals, this is an orientation question. And there's been now studies that will show that even sky glow, not direct glare, so you're not seeing the actual pinpoints of light, but sky glow over the land can cause turtles, the hatchling turtles, to go in the wrong direction. And then they're pretty much goners, AKA dead. Then the other issue is that they can get disoriented. So there's kind of like misorientation, going the wrong direction, but there's also just disoriented and then ending up attracted to some individual light source, for example. So you will find instead of all of the hatchlings going sort of mostly in one direction, when you've got a lot of light pollution around, they're going to go in a bunch of different directions and often then end up gathered underneath light sources that are close. And so it's a behavior that was completely adaptive for millions of years and now is not adaptive with the environment that we've created for them.
Right. So for migratory birds, what happens is that they get attracted to the light from cities during their migration at night, which used to be dark, and then they can collide with buildings. For sea turtles, the hatchlings are confused about where to go after they crawl up out of their nest. Usually, they would find the ocean by recognizing the light level on the horizon. But now, with human-made sky glow, hatchlings tend to go in the wrong direction or are generally confused about the direction they have to go in. I also asked Travis, what about circadian rhythms? In humans, we know that light at night can lead to disruption of our rhythms. Do we also know something about how artificial light and light at night is influencing the circadian rhythms of animals?
Yeah, absolutely. The daily rhythms. And so everything that you know from circadian biology about humans, most of it was learned from studying model organisms that were not humans. And B, everything else has all these same phenomena. And unless it's some cave-adapted species that lives deep underground and or at the bottom of the ocean, where there's literally no variability in light. So yes, all of these things, and you can go back to a simple thing like when do birds sing in the morning? So that it's referred to as the dawn chorus. And studies looking at when the dawn chorus started don't have a lot of quantified research pre-electric light, but even areas as light pollution has increased, looking at that dawn chorus becoming earlier in the morning, right? And so that's a behavior that comes from the circadian rhythm. But every one of those behaviors, if you go back and had the time and energy to look at the molecular, internal driving physiology, you would find all of the sort of same things that you find in human circadian.
Right. So the birds sing earlier with like more and more light pollution. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, the dawn chorus. And there's even examples of birds that will sing looking for mates during the full moon and then not during the new moon. And then when you put lights up, then they'll sing under the lights as well. So there's all sorts of these little examples. We used to get calls from people in Los Angeles complaining about birds singing. I'm like, well, this time of year, that's a male looking for a mate. And naturally, they would sing under the full moon. But do you have lights on around your property? Well, yeah. Okay, well, turn the lights off and hope he finds a mate. That's what you maybe get him to stop singing at night sooner. But, that's just one example. There's literally everything, right? The levels of stress, the rates of development, the different hormones that are produced. So all of these things are playing out. Gene expression, all of these things are playing out in the daily rhythms of organisms as well. Even plants, that anticipate the dawn by the amount of herbivore defenses that they have, pulling away the layers, and you're going to find circadian rhythms in pretty much everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, from first year biology in a university and some zoology classes I took, I remember that, when you change the behavior of one animal, one organism, one species in an ecosystem, that affects everything else in the ecosystem, right? And so now we talked a little bit about how the behaviors of some animals is changed due to light pollution. So there must be consequences then, like secondary consequences on other organisms and then ecosystems, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and if you think about it, like organisms that are doing different things may be influenced slightly differently, and that would, have follow-on effects. So street lights that attract more predatory insects, for example, might reduce the numbers of other types of insects under the streetlight. So there's a series of studies that look at like the insect community under lights and how that changes. But all the way up and down the sort of taxonomic breadth and body size breadth, you're going to find these things. We have done a little work with colleagues on the distribution of mountain lions, our big cats in Southern California, and find that one of the really good predictors of where they're using their territory is what light is there. And they avoid the lights. Others have simultaneously looked at mountain lions and mule deer, which is their main prey, and find that the mule deer are actually avoiding areas that the mountain lions are using more. And so they're like closer in certain urbanized environments, not everywhere, but in urbanized environments, the mule deer are like taking advantage of it being a little brighter around people because the mountain lions don't like to come that close to them. And so it's like a shield. And yeah, so all these distributions are going to be influenced by that. Pollination is an obvious one, and with spillover effects. So for example, out of Switzerland, a research group there looking at artificially lighting a meadow with a street light, and then looking at the pollination of plants, the seed set of the plants, and then also the visitors to the flowers in the daytime. And they found not only were the lights at night influencing the nighttime pollinators, but because fewer seeds were set, there were fewer flowers and fewer daytime pollinators. So sometimes the connections don't just stay where you think the impact is. It spills over the 24-hour cycle because in this instance, the nocturnally pollinated plants are also nectar sources for the diurnal insects. Really, really painstaking, fabulous, interesting research.
To summarize, light pollution affects animals because animals, just like humans, are incredibly tied to the light and dark cycle. And so they also use light to orient themselves, communicate with each other, and time their behavior. And because light pollution affects the behavior of a species, like the mountain lion in California, then also its prey change their behavior, and the whole ecosystem and dynamics between predators and prey can actually change because of light pollution. I then also asked Travis, what are some examples of countries that are taking actions to mitigate ecological light pollution? Do you see like a difference in different countries in how like attentive they are to the topic of light pollution with respect to its effect on ecology?
Yeah, there's certainly differences around the world that range from what's light pollution all the way to careful laws that are trying to protect natural areas and species from light pollution. So it runs the entire range, and different countries are sort of at different points of development of their awareness and regulatory structures to deal with it. Some of the places that have some of the worst light pollution have maybe recognized it the most. So the Netherlands, for example, is pretty bright, but has also done some of the best research and leading research around the world. Germany too, has done a lot of research and is ahead of I'm just going to say most places in the United States on average, and then other places around the world where light is seen as a signifier of economic growth and benefits, and we shouldn't lose sight of that human sort of potential and opportunity in the modern world is associated with electricity and access to modern technology, and we shouldn't be going around telling people you can't have light because sometimes there are other problems that need desperate attention before you're going to get around to dealing with light pollution. But if you look at the members and the participation in the DarkSky International conference, the global nonprofit that addresses this issue, there are people literally now around the world who are linked up and sort of feeding off of each other's experiences and recognition of the challenges and where they are in this interconnected planet of how to deal with this real common experience. And this is what motivates many people from the outset, which is just the ability to see the stars and feel, basically insignificant speck in the face of the universe under the night sky. And that is something that we all experience or could experience. And it's the legacy of our ancestors that they had that we're robbing from our next generations. So that is a conversation that's going on globally, and wildlife and plants and crops that are also impacted by light pollution all just become part of that conversation.
So yeah, let's have this conversation and talk about how to do things better and how to use light more responsibly. For this, I spoke to an architect and lighting designer who researches various aspects of lighting in the built and natural environment.
Yes, so my name is Karolina Zielińska-Dąbkowska. It's a rather long name. I'm originally Polish, and I'm based in Poland, in north part of Poland, in Gdańsk, the city where Solidarity movement started back then in 80s and before 80s. And I'm an associate professor at Gdańsk Technical University.
First, I wanted a bit of a perspective about this problem, about light pollution. How did we get here in the first place? Why did we start to have so much light at night?
I would say human beings started to use light, especially, the first electric lighting. And we are talking not about a very far distance, because we are talking at around the 19th century, end of the 19th century. So imagine the first electric street lighting was kind of put in place in 1879. And then, of course, there were different things coming up. You would have buildings which were illuminated, and it was just to show the prestige. So with electric lighting, there was a possibility to show your status if you were a company or if you were, wealthy person, right? And you would have, imagine a palace or castle. So these were the beginnings. And of course, slowly and surely a light was introduced to provide lighting on the routes and pedestrian paths. And I would say more and more it was introduced later on where the first cars were introduced. So you can imagine, behind all of those decisions, there are humans, and very often, people would not perceive this as even something negative. It was a very positive thing until the end of the 20th century. There were, lighting design professionals were people who were coming from, they were having different backgrounds. They were architects, like landscape architects, sometimes people from the theater, and they would put their, hands-on experience into illuminating the city, making city like beautifying the city or making them accessible at night. So it was more to do with this approach of making the night not so dangerous in terms of, safety and security, right? But also to allow people to use the space at night. But of course, nobody was considering this as something negative. So as I mentioned before, astronomers were the first one in 1970s who were kind of already, highlighting the problems. Then you would have slowly, a general public with the, setup of International DarkSky Association, for example, right? They are called not now, they changed the name. They are called DarkSky International. But it was the first general public organizations, NGO, where the general public were the members, and it was set up because of the awareness that they are losing the dark nights, right? And there is this negative impact of this obtrusive light. But actually, the next steps, if you think about this, it was, it was around 2000 where the first light pollution prevention laws were proclaimed in Europe. And of course, what follows, you will have environmental scientists starting to observe ecological light pollution, which is a distinct term, because ecological light pollution means it has impact on ecology and all living creatures, and on light sources on flora and fauna. And then, of course, so there is this next movement, 2013, and a big thing, establishment of the Artificial Light at Night, ALAN, where with the first ALAN conference, where different international interdisciplinary researchers are coming together, and they are talking about different aspects. So, and more, and there are, of course, we could talk about this, but, this is slowly getting a momentum.
And so if we think about the current state of things when planning lighting in urban areas, are there actual standards for how much light can be allowed at night? So say like architects or urban planners are planning the lighting of a specific square in a city. How do they know, okay, how many luminaires can we have? How much street light can we actually implement in the city? Yeah, like how do they decide what's enough lighting and what's healthy lighting?
So, of course, there are lighting standards, and there are different lighting standards. There are ones which are describing the illumination on the roads and pedestrian pathways, right? And there are some other parameters which are also described, like, for example, uniformity. And I have to say that most of the standards were designed towards cars, vehicular traffic, not for pedestrians. So that's quite kind of, interesting that, if you consider cars having headlights, you actually not necessarily need additional lighting. But it was the case, I think research wasn't done before, and keep in mind that lighting industry is quite strong. So for them, it was important to sell a lot of luminaires and also light sources, right? So that's one of the aspects. There are also standards for the buildings. There are standards, but standards are not really laws. So there are more recommendations. But because they are recommended, whoever is designing it, they want to be on the safe side, and they are planning according to those. Meaning, if there would be, let's say, if something will happen, there will be an accident. Let's say you have staircase, right? Or a ramp. And somebody would fall and they would break a leg, and they would probably bring the owner of the building or, even like the city to the court. If it was not according to those, regulations, they might be in trouble. So they would try to avoid this.
Karolina also explained that when deciding for an urban lighting system, there are different groups of professionals that have different interests. Those that are more interested in safety and following the standards, those that are more focused on the design side of things, and then, of course, professionals who have an interest in actually selling luminaires.
The first ones visible, at the beginning, were illuminating engineers or electrical engineers. So their approach would be very technical. So they would go with horizontal illuminance and lux. Just to remind our, audience, lux is a unit of illuminance in the International System of Units. And it tells you how bright a surface appears to be when illuminated, right? So imagine horizontal illuminance. When we talk about horizontal illuminance, and this is what those engineers would consider, is how much light you will get on the road. But obviously, this is not working for the humans because we are standing upwards. We have, our vision, we do not look down, we look towards, something. So the vertical illuminance would be much more important. And this is nowadays, like recently considered by standards, but only for pedestrian lighting. There are pedestrian road classes, where you should consider this as well. But I mean, it's I don't want to go into this, but it's a complex thing. But the other group, which is also designing illumination, are lighting architects, or also lighting designers. So they would try to kind of get the aesthetics and the technical approach. And also nowadays we are also interested in all the research and the impact lighting can have, and how can we minimize the impact. But there is the third group, which I would consider can potentially make the most damage. These are representative of the lighting industry, the representative of luminaire manufacturers, because their idea is to design luminaires and sell them. And of course, their income is in selling as much as they can. So, but there, I have to say, they are now also collaborating. Some, not all, some are collaborating with DarkSky International, and there is this special system of improvement for luminaires to make them, dark sky friendly. And some luminaires are luminaire manufacturers, and some luminaires are actually accepted. So you can find a list of those friendlier. Yeah, this is probably something which is changing, and they are collaborating with researchers. So luminaire manufacturers nowadays and light source manufacturers are collaborating often with luminaire designers, but also researchers and lighting designers to create a unique approach towards a certain project, right? If this is environmentally sensitive area and so on. So yeah, there is things are changing. It's slow, and of course, you can read here or there about those projects, but they are not, like common knowledge, and not all the luminaire manufacturers would have those kind of luminaire types, but they do exist, I would say.
So I asked Karolina, thinking about how to do things better, what are the elements that we need for responsible lighting in urban areas then? She told me about these 5 principles for responsible outdoor lighting.
They have those 5 points where they talk about responsible lighting being useful, targeted, having low level of lighting, being controlled, and also being on a warm colored light, on a warm side. And it has all of it. It has a reason behind. But imagine, for example, the useful thing. The approach is to use light only if it's needed, and that the light should have a clear purpose. If this is not the case, you should not really apply lighting. And of course, it's difficult to say, because they are, even if you think about Paris, they sometimes call it Paris a city of light, right? I mean, or other like tourist places and historic places. They might have a master plans, and they might have a law which is prohibiting lighting at certain time in certain areas and so on. But there are, in the city center, there are exempt from the rules, right? So I would say it has to be definitely follow those responsible outdoor lighting principles, but then you have to have a smart group of people who would know how to implement it and where, right?
Okay, so first principle for responsible outdoor lighting should be useful. Second principle, lighting should be targeted.
So you want to direct lighting that it would fall on a certain, surface. If you have, for example, a street lighting, you want to have the lighting, just street lighting, only illuminating the road, right? You don't want to have lighting which is radiating all over the place, and it's causing the, light trespass and glaring people and so on, right?
Third principle, lighting should be at low levels.
We should try to use the lowest light levels required, not to go over, because some people decided once that those levels should be in place. And of course, I have to say that if you think about who is deciding, who is sitting in those lighting gremiums for standards and recommendations, these were in the past. Now it's changing. But in the past, you would have representative of luminaire manufacturers or lamp manufacturers. So they would be pushing for high level, not necessarily based on research, right? So this is a tricky one, but you can prove that. I will give you a very good example. New York City, I'm not sure if you visited, but I can imagine that our listeners have been to New York City. In New York City, there are areas which are very, very dark with really minimum light levels. And these are, for example, parks. And this was done based on also on experiments and research. And it has to do not with the horizontal illuminance or uniformity, but with the appearance, how you perceive a space, and how you perceive the space. It would feel you safe or unsafe. In New York City, you can have a dark park, but in the distance, because we see our space as three-dimensional space, if you see the illumination of the shop fronts, you would know where to run for help, or you would kind of define the space, even if you are in a really dark area in the park. So I think it's about to understanding, the space and and also human perception.
Principle number 4, lighting should be controlled.
And you can use controls. You can use different things. You can use timers. You can use motion detectors. So you can have light being at a minimum. And then imagine there is, for example, for the pedestrian area, when you have residential area, you not necessarily need at 3 o'clock or 1 o'clock at night, all the street lighting being on. It's not necessary. And also this lighting is disturbing people's sleep, right? So you can have motion detectors, which is detecting motions. If there is a car passing by or if there is a pedestrian passing by, those dimmed light, they can slowly go up. And then, usually it's around 20% and then go to 100. And then after the person will pass or the car will pass, then they can, or the person cycling will, pass. Then you can go back to the lower level. So it's possible. You have the technology nowadays.
5th and last principle, use warm colored lighting.
And the 5th one about using warmer colors and also trying to limit the shorter wavelength, the blue, violet, rich light, is based on research that we know that this is impacting our well-being and health. We were not designed as humans, and also not only humans, but animals, to be exposed to this kind of wavelengths and artificial lighting at night.
Right. So light should be useful, targeted, low level, controlled, and warm in color. And using outdoor lighting more responsibly doesn't just apply to urban lighting designers and architects. We can all think about these 5 points when we use lighting outdoors. So to wrap up the episode, let's do a super quick recap before we close, because I know this episode has been a bit longer than usual, and also because the summer heat is melting me away in this little studio that has no AC because it's too loud for the recording and no windows. Let's go. What did we learn today? So light pollution is basically all artificial light that's produced by humans at night. That ranges from sky glow over cities to light trespass spilling into places it doesn't belong. We know that nighttime light disrupts our circadian rhythms and suppresses melatonin production. And today we heard that growing evidence links high levels of light exposure at night to negative health outcomes. That includes breast cancer risk and cardiometabolic issues like obesity, stroke, and higher cholesterol levels. But measuring light exposure in this context is a little bit tricky, and we still need better studies to understand what is really the mechanism behind these risks. We also learned that light pollution doesn't just affect us. Animals rely on natural patterns of light and dark for orientation, communication, and survival. Think of migratory birds drawn off course by city lights, or sea turtle hatchlings heading in the wrong direction. But also dynamics between predators who are scared of light and prey who take advantage of this to move towards illuminated urban areas. And lastly, what can we do better? Well, as Karolina put it, it's a movement, and slowly we're seeing collaboration between all parties involved. Researchers, lighting designers who care about aesthetics, and lighting industry who has to change the way they think about lighting. And talking about what you can do, other than using light responsibly, I'll leave you with this quote from Travis.
But importantly, it is also supporting people who are working on policies that influence lighting more generally. So municipal street lighting policies, having your local council person, whatever kind of council that is, let them know that it's something that you care about and that you want them to pay attention to. Every level of government that exists could address this in one way or another, and just people communicating that importance to their sort of sense of place and pride in place, I think is really useful and can lead to more action, which we are seeing, and these things do work. Is municipal ordinances, state ordinances, county ordinances, national ordinances, and rules that give you all the light you need to do the things that we do at night and don't waste stuff harming other species.
That's it for today, and actually that's it for Season 3 of Light O'Clock. We have some vague plans for special in-between seasons episodes, so stay tuned for those. But before, I'm taking a little break from the mic. Enjoy the end of summer, and I'll catch you here next time. You have been listening to Light O'Clock. This podcast is produced by me, Caro Guidolin. The podcast team includes many of my amazingly supportive colleagues and lab members. Manuel Spitzchen does the scientific fact-checking, and music, mix, and sound design are done by Ingo Bednarek. Show notes and additional resources are created by Maidel Fernandez Alonso and myself. Our social media team includes Lucien Bickerstaff, Nilufar Tabande, and Zara Alkaf. And Anna Magdalena Billa is our test listener. Light O'Clock is a podcast produced by the Translational Sensory and Circadian Neuroscience Unit, and we are supported by the Circadian Mental Health Network, the Viscom Prize from the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Psychologie and the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Psychophysiologie und ihre Anwendung, the Max Planck Society and the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics, and the Technical University of Munich.